It is common knowledge that the Golden Spike was driven in Utah to celebrate the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. Everything known beyond that is probably a myth. The historian George Krauss wrote that much folklore has circulated about the events of May 10, 1869. In spite of hundreds of books and scholarly works being written, the true story of the Transcontinental Railroad is obscured in tall tales and misinformation, and is still being rediscovered today. Let's crack open some of the myths about this important historical accomplishment in this episode of Everything You Thought You Knew About the Transcontinental Railroad Is Not True. You might have heard this story. The stage was set, the last tie was laid, and the Golden Spike placed for the final ceremonious driving by the dignitaries at Promontory Summit on May 10, 1869. The telegrapher had wired the silver spike maul and the golden spike to the telegraph lines to facilitate what may have been the earliest live broadcast of an event, marking done with 3 taps of maul to spike. Leland Stanford, governor of California and president of the Central Pacific Railroad, stepped forward and took the maul. He wound up for a strike. The crowds held their breath in anticipation. He swung and he missed. The silver maul hit the rail with a disappointing thud. Embarrassed, he passed the maul to Doc Durant from the Union Pacific, who likewise missed the mark. The telegrapher had to hurriedly tap out ... himself with the key, since the circuit was not closed and those listening across the country did not hear the final driving of the last spike. A nearby track worker ran out from the crowd to take the maul and drive the spike himself. This story is often told to illustrate the folly of the pampered robber barons who had never worked a day in their lives, and even made it into the script of the reenacted ceremony that volunteers put on at Golden Spike National Historic Park on weekends and special events. It also is not true. The real story of the last spike ceremony is convoluted. While there were many reporters and plenty of eyewitnesses who wrote journals, crowds were thick and the proceedings confusing due to last-minute changes to the plan, almost no schedule, and plenty of improvisation. Many of the reports conflict with each other on certain details, so it is difficult to make sense of what exactly happened on that historic day. However, there is no mention in any of the primary sources of the people who saw the ceremony that Stanford nor Durant missed the spike. Grenville Dodge wrote the following in his unpublished autobiography. On the occasion of the completion of the road, there assembled on the bleak mountainside representatives of nearly all the civilized nations. As the last spike was driven, connection was made with every telegraph office between the Atlantic and the Pacific, and every blow was heard throughout the land. Dr. Durant took his position by the north rail, and Governor Stanford stood by the south, and when the signal was given, both gentlemen struck the spikes. By an arrangement with W.H. Hibbard, Esquire, superintendent of the Western Union Telegraph Company, a wire was attached to the spike, so that when it was struck by Governor Stanford, that instant the electric spark communicated with the cities east and west and announced that the work was done. A New York Times reporter wrote the following. Promontory Point, all ready now, the spikes will be driven. The signal will be 3 dots for the commencement of the blows. For a moment the instrument was silent, then the hammer of the magnet tapped the bell. 1, 2, 3. The signal. Another pause of a few seconds, and the lightning came flashing eastward, vibrating over 2,400 miles between the junction of the 2 roads in Washington, and the blows of the hammer upon the spike were measured instantly in telegraphic accents on the bell. At 2:47 p.m., Promontory Point gave the signal, done, and the continent was spanned with iron. As mentioned, there are no eyewitness accounts that describe Leland Stanford missing the spike. It would have been impossible for him to swing and miss anyway, because gold is a very soft metal, and the swing of a spike maul with full momentum would have smashed the golden spike into an unrecognizable hunk. The spike still exists. While there are 6 dents in the head that indicate that it was softly hit, presumably with the maul, there is no sign at all that it was driven into the tie like an iron spike would have. The maul also still exists, and there is no evidence on that tool either of any kind of accidental strikes against an iron rail. If anything, the silver maul was used to make small, gentle taps on the head of the spike as a symbolic gesture, a motion that would have been nearly impossible to mess up. In fact, Stanford and Durant were not the only individuals to have taken a crack at symbolic spike driving. Almost every dignitary present passed the mall amongst themselves to take a tap on either a ceremonial spike or one of the normal iron spikes that held the rail in place. Even the military officers drew their swords to take a hit or two on the spikes with their hilts. Captain Charles Currier of the 21st United States Infantry wrote the following in his journal. "We have just witnessed the laying of the last rail. Crowds began assembling at 7 a.m. There were several thousands present, and the ceremonies were opened with a prayer by a minister from Massachusetts. A covered wooden tie, beautifully polished and appropriately engraved, was then brought out and placed in position by the highest officials of each railroad. A spike of gold was then produced with a silver hammer. A telegraph wire was attached to the spike. At a given signal, 1, 2, 3 strokes were made with the silver hammer. The telegraph wires were so arranged that taps were flashed to all parts of the United States, so that eager thousands in all great cities knew the rail was laid and the railroad complete. Truly, it was worth the trip from New Hampshire alone to see this great achievement. 2 beautifully decorated engines, one of each road, advanced until the guards touched. The engineers climbed out and broke a bottle of champagne across the space and took hands. Natty and I were permitted to give a stroke. I used my sword hilt. Our regiment marched up and stood at parade rest while our pictures were taken, then our regimental band played." The best accounting of what happened at the Golden Spike ceremony is based on the documentation compiled by Bob Spood in a Park Service appendix on the last spike ceremony. As best as can be told, after Governor Stanford concluded his speechifying, the ceremonial spikes were presented and slipped one by one into holes previously drilled into the laurel wood tie. L.W. Cove, the Pacific Union Express Company, stepped forward and presented Stanford with the ceremonial silver maul, which was already wired up beforehand. Stanford and Durant, who had his own maul, stood on opposite sides of the rail and each made 2 light taps on the spikes. The emphasis is on light. This is how eyewitnesses described it, not swinging blows. The light contact between the spike and maul would have been more than sufficient to close the telegraphic circuit and send its signal. With this complete, a telegraph from President Ulysses S. Grant was read out loud, and Durant, who claimed to have been suffering from a headache, withdrew to the director's car on the Union Pacific train. From there, the other dignitaries, the women, the military officers, each made their own touch to these spikes. So where did this story come from? The earliest version appeared in a speech given by Grenville Dodge on the 40th anniversary of the driving of the Golden Spike in 1909, which was edited and printed in Dodge's book, How We Built the Union Pacific Railway, and Other Railway Papers and Addresses. Reading Dodge's typed memoirs, it is clear that Dodge did not consider Stanford nor Durant to be his friends. So the best guess is that the story about Stanford and Durant missing the spike was made up to embarrass the Central Pacific president and the then former Union Pacific president, as Durant was only at Promontory as a formality and had already been voted off the board as the Credit Mobilier scandal was in the early stages of public discovery. Notice that in the quotation that I read earlier, Dodge did not mention Stanford nor Durant missing the spike, and in fact specifically described the maul making contact with the spike. 10 years later, Edwin Sabin embellished the tale in his 50th anniversary book, Building the Pacific Railway. What reason was there to doubt Grenville Dodge? He was there, after all, even if he didn't bother to mention Stanford's hilarious blunder for 4 whole decades. Once Sabin wrote it down, the fiction became fact. Shortly after Sabin's book went to the printers, Alexander Topance, a French immigrant and Utah cattleman, began work on his own memoirs about his experiences developing the Wild West. He claimed to have been present on May 10, 1869, an accomplishment that he leveraged to gain a prominent position in the 1919 Golden Spike Jubilee celebrations in Ogden. After the events, he began writing and described the original Golden Spike ceremony. When they came to drive the last spike, Governor Stanford, president of the Central Pacific, took the sledge, and the first time he struck, he missed the spike and hit the rail. What a howl went up! Irish, Chinese, Mexicans, and everybody yelled with delight. Everybody slapped everybody else on the back and yelled, "He missed it! Yee!" If Topance were to be trusted, this would make him and Dodge the only men who noticed the slip-up. However, his narrative is highly suspect. He was almost 80 years old when he started writing and died in 1923 before his book was finished. His wife added to the manuscript after his death and published it. It contains a number of easily disprovable yarns about notable figures in the Wild West that Topance claimed to have met throughout his life. For example, he claimed to have known the famed lawman and outlaw Orrin Porter Rockwell very well. Yet he didn't know him well enough to recognize that Rockwell could not read, did not smoke, and did not carry his pistols on the belt, but rather in his coat pocket, which are all things that Topance claimed to have happened in his presence. It is likely that Topance had access to Dodge's 1909 book, or Sabin's 1919 book, and tailored his accounting to match their narratives. This doesn't mean that the entirety of Topance's memoirs were fraudulent, but there is evidence that he consulted existing books to ensure that his book harmonized with other authors' works, whether he experienced it that way or not. Robert Lardon Fulton, a Union Pacific telegrapher and dispatcher, wrote his own memoirs about the Transcontinental Railroad in 1924. He tactfully addressed many myths that appeared in the earlier 1919 histories of the railroad, using his own memories and interviews he made with witnesses of the railroad building. Even though he joked about Stanford and Durant's amateur swings, he admits that they still hit the spikes. If the truth must be told, they swung like beginners at golf, but holes had been bored in the ties, so the spikes went home quite successfully. The New York Times account is often cited to back up the claim that the on-site telegrapher had to tap out 3 dots himself because Stanford missed the spike. But the wording of the report is clear. 3 dots was merely the signal for all the other operators to step back and listen because the spike driving was about to be transmitted. After those 3 dots were given, there were several seconds of silence along the wire, and then the taps of the maul and the spike were heard. Only then did the telegrapher give the final signal, D-O-N-E, done. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, please consider supporting me on Patreon. The link can be found in the description. This series is being made in my free time, and your contributions will improve future episodes. Thank you for joining me here at Great Basin Car Shops.